State University. He then earned a PhD in history and a master's in library and information science from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where he wrote his dissertation on the Black Hawk War. He has taught for the University of Illinois, Ohio State University, Western Illinois University, Mount Vernon Nazarene University, and other institutions. He worked for 3 years at OSU's Newark Earthworks Center and currently teaches for North Central State College in Mansfield, Ohio. And he'll be presenting on problematic preservation, finding, keeping, losing, and reclaiming Ohio's ancient earthworks. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Well, like many ideas, the idea for this paper began with a couple of guys drinking around a fire. It was during COVID, though, so there were separate fires about 40 miles apart from each other, but the principle's the same. I was talking to Rob Cook, who was an archaeologist friend I worked with at OSU Newark, at the Newark Earthworks Center. And understandably enough, given his work and our shared history, our conversation turned to Ohio's Native American past. I asked him whether he thought any of the state's mounds or earthworks or other sites had been particularly well preserved. And then we started thinking about the sites that we were familiar with and found that answering that question was harder than we thought. And so we kind of began collaborating on this. Let me see if I can get my PowerPoint here started. There's no real good way to determine how many mounds or earthworks existed in Ohio prior to the 19th century, but they obviously numbered in the thousands, mostly people belonging to cultures that we now refer to as Adena and Hopewell, 1500 to 1,000 years ago. By the time anyone attempted to conduct a systematic survey to catalog them during the late 19th century, a lot of damage had been done. Off-the-record consultations with not just Rob, but some of his colleagues suggest there were probably somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 mounds in Ohio at the time it became a state. About 2,000 of them remained when they published the Archaeological Survey of Ohio in 1915. And perhaps 2/3 of those have been lost since then, and maybe more than that. We might be down to 10% of that. Preservation has just never been a high priority in Ohio. And that raises the key questions. What protected those that do remain, and why were any of them saved at all? Let's see if I can share this better. What makes preservation likely was one of the things. There had to be a recognition of value, historic, economic, something to make people want to save these things. But there's also sort of uncontrollable factors. The timing of population growth later seems to be better than earlier. The rate of population growth, slow growth, is better due to rapid increase in land values. The size of the population center around them. A medium city is better than a large one. St. Louis and Cincinnati are good examples. They're big cities. They kind of rub out everything. Location of these mounds in relation to their population center, mounds and earthworks, adjacency seems to be key. If you're too close, you get rubbed out because the land is too valuable. If you're too remote, they get rubbed out because they're just not appreciated. Whether that obliteration is rapid with bulldozers and gravel pits or just plowing and neglect. And a big factor then and now is support of local elites. If the right people deem it useful, a mound or an earthwork has a much greater chance of being preserved in one way or another, if they can find some purpose for it. The pictures on the slide there are actually of the cemetery across about 250 yards across the street from me. There's a nice little Medina mound up there that's been repurposed as graves for the town's 19th century movers and shakers. They obviously lopped it off, terraced it, did all sorts of work, but allegedly it's preserved. Some case studies can help us illustrate how past efforts of preservation have yielded, we're going to call them mixed results. Marietta is the first one that I decided to look at. This is the first legal American settlement in the Ohio country. Most people are probably familiar with it because of the Pioneers book that Dave McCullough wrote, whether we liked it or not. Just a quick timeline: 1783, Britain ceded the Northwest Territory to the U.S. 1785, the land ordinance prepared the Trans-Appalachian land for sale, let American fill their government coffers while putting citizens on the ground in a contested region. And in summer of 1786, the Ohio Company, a joint stock company whose key players were New Englanders like Rufus Putnam, Winthrop Sargent, and others who were also Revolutionary War veterans, they staked claim to Marietta and the land around it. Why there? Well, they chose it for a variety of reasons. Right across the river was Fort Harmar, which offered comfort and protection at a time when American settlements were being bitterly opposed by the region's indigenous people. The Muskingum River itself offers decent port access to the Ohio River and to the interior of the country, but mostly it seems to be those earthworks that sealed the deal. The ruins, which is what they called them, that Putnam and his fellow New Englanders found in Marietta offered notoriety for their project. Archaeology as a discipline was still in its infancy, and while mounds had been dug into before by Thomas Jefferson infamously and by various others, including slaves, I guess, they had never really been explored on the type of scale that Ohio offered. Almost immediately, those seeds of the mound builder myth that had started floating around came into fruition here as Ohio Company officials and visitors to Marietta began describing the earthworks and imagining this mysterious and civilized race that had created them in the distant past, only to vanish, perhaps falling victim to the barbarous savages that now hindered American expansion into the region. Sort of the Gibbon approach to it, I guess. The earthworks and the romantic but fictional backstory that came with them also made for evergreen articles that could be printed and reprinted throughout New England. What may have been good filler for newspaper editors, though, was great advertising for Marietta's founders, with the potential to draw migrants and tourists who may well want to purchase land once they recognize its potential. So these earthworks offered them something. They could also be comforting. The traditional American origin story is that many of the nation's key values and assumptions, characteristics like rugged individualism, ample opportunity for all, manifest destiny, all that stuff that we learn about and then spend our careers writing against, they kind of stem from that frontier experience. Republican values are assumed to arise somehow in the process of civilizing the wilderness. But the other side of that story, more common during the colonial era than after, but still in the air, was that so-called wilderness eroded civilized behavior and that the frontier promoted cultural degeneration. The presence of these earthworks suggested, however, that the American settlement of Marietta was not about confronting the wilderness. Rather, it was about restoring civilization to a place where it had already been. They also provided American settlers and citizens access to an ancient past that's at least as worthy of attention as anything that Europe had to offer. And it made Marietta a monumental city, or potentially at least a monumental city, like Rome, and a capital in the past that could serve as one in the future, if the company officials had their way. Putnam and Associates did not hesitate to play up that connection, even though they destroyed much of the complex, including several mounds, a cemetery, and some other features, really all the stuff here, and overlaid it with a grid of streets and town lots. They identified 4 prominent ancient elements, designated the area surrounding each of them as a public square, and legitimated them with Latin-sounding names. They set up the Sacra Via, a wide street lined with parallel walls, which led from the river past their blockhouse, which was called Campus Martius, to 2 rectilinear platform mounds, Capitoline, which was named for Republican Rome's citadel and highest point, and Quadranao, named for its political center. Conus, the complex's largest conical mound, was just southeast and was also got a square. But they didn't stop with just giving them Latin names or Latinish names. During the same set of meetings in 1791, where company officials dealt with undeniable existential problems, which included a pending financial crisis and military actions against Shawnees, Miamis, and other native groups who didn't want them there, they took the time to consider how best to not only preserve, but to improve their earthworks, to the point of micromanaging landscape design. The square surrounding the Great Mound over here, for example, was to be laid out with mulberry trees, joined at each corner with an elm, parallel rows of honey locusts, weeping willows, evergreens, and more mulberries spaced 20 to 30 feet apart and aligned with the surrounding streets would frame the mound itself. Similar specific instructions were provided for Capitolium and Quadranal. This offered the bounty of nature and the orderliness of civilization without any of the downsides of the chaotic and dangerous wilderness, which was bound to impress visitors and potential investors. While obviously imperfect and a far cry from how most of us would have preferred, Putnam and Sargent and the rest of the Ohio Company officials offered a model for how elements of an ancient landscape could be appropriated as ready-made urban features in modern American cities. Their motives may have been venal, their instincts more pragmatic than pure, and no one today would accuse them of being culturally sensitive, but they did save something. As the PowerPoint moves without my knowledge. Unlike their rivals downriver in Cincinnati, they did save a lot. So they deserve some credit for that, especially given the early day of their attempt. Now, this is the time of year when many of us have been assigning grades. I tip my hand on this one. And bearing in mind that I teach a lot of adjunct classes and I'm therefore prone to grade inflation, I'm giving Marietta a C- for its preservation efforts. Leads to the standard student request. Why didn't I get an A? Well, there's all sorts of reasons. The reach of the Ohio Company exceeded its grasp. Shady business and political dealings, failed attempts to become the preeminent city of the Northwest, and all that sent the company into bankruptcy and other shenanigans. So they failed to build the city they designed or improve the public squares as they planned before turning them over to city officials. Quadranal and Capitolium, under city control, languished as parks and pasture for a good long while and suffered a good deal of neglect, erosion, and people digging into them and looking for things. Quadranal, diminished in size and eroded, is there, but doesn't seem as impressive as they might have had us imagine it. Capitolium is more prominent, but the Washington County Library is sitting on top of it. So it's preserved, but not necessarily commemorated. Conus, the Great Mound, fared better, largely because its public square became Mound Cemetery. But while it's the cemetery's high point, it isn't exactly highlighted there. Much more attention is given to the fact that it contains the largest collection of the graves of Revolutionary War veterans anywhere in the country. It's a celebration of Marietta's founders rather than a commemoration of a more ancient past. And ironically, the individual who had once been buried within this mound itself was dug up and removed along with his grave goods early in the 1800s, evicting dead native people along with living ones, apparently. And one of the site's most prominent markers begins, "The origins and disappearance of prehistoric mound builders has long been shrouded in mystery," thus reiterating the long disproven narrative from Putnam's day and sort of detaching all of this from actual Native American people. Throw in a monument dedicated to American imperialism, carved by Gutzon Borglum, the Mount Rushmore Gutzon Borglum, entitled "Start Westward of the United States," that depicts 3 of Marietta's pioneers on it. And it becomes apparent that the focus of the city's public spaces is not firmly fixed on reconnecting to its ancient or indigenous past. So take the C-, consider how to improve. It's a lot of potential there, but they didn't quite deliver what they promised. Another case study is Circleville. The town fathers of Circleville followed the Marietta model by appropriating ancient earthworks for modern purposes, but they were perhaps not quite so ambitious. They may have had less to work with initially, but they managed to achieve some notoriety nonetheless. Um, they created what one urban planner called perhaps the only city in North America developing a radiocentric plan, whose form was determined by earthworks constructed by Aboriginal peoples. But that model wasn't going to last. Quick timeline. January 1810, the Ohio legislature established Pickaway County. February, 3 commissioners were appointed to select a site for its county seat. And in spring of 1810, several sites were considered, but they selected a site on the Shota River marked by these geometric earthworks, a circle and a square. The circular enclosure was surrounded by 2 walls with a deep ditch between them. The square had 1 wall and no ditch. And from the bottom of the ditch to the top of the walls in the circle was about 20 feet, so they were pretty impressive. Caleb Atwater over here was surprised at the perfection with which both enclosures had been laid out. After attempting to find some deviation from true geometry, he could find none, allowing that the measurements were much more correct than it would have been in all probability had the present inhabitants undertaken to construct such a work. July 25th of 1810, Daniel Driesbach was appointed to purchase the land and lay it a town. And being an Ohioan of his era, his first thing he did was rub out that perfect square, overlaying it with a standard Midwestern grid pattern and subdividing it into town lots. But he had other plans for the circle, and he made that the centerpiece of the town. There's sort of a stylized painting of it. The circle was set aside as an open space in the center, about 400 feet in diameter, and an octagonal courthouse was constructed right in the middle of it. Each side of that building faced a radial street extending to Circle Street, which followed the outer limits of the original earthwork, which is about 1,100 feet in diameter, give or take. And between the central open space and Circle Street, another circular street, Circle Alley, went around, and 4 streets enclosed the whole circle, creating a square 1,500 feet on each side, roughly. These center lots are strangely shaped, but they're available for sale at premium prices. This is the heart of the town. And the wasted land at the corners could be used for county purposes. The southeast was a county jail and sheriff's house. The northeast was a school and academy. The others were to be assigned later. Now, Driesbach had altered the
Michael,
original.
sorry to jump in, but just you have about 60 seconds left.
Oh my goodness.
Just
Well, there's a whole lot of other stuff because apparently I'm much slower than I think I am. They rubbed it out. There's nothing left. What grade did they get? They got an F. They got an F because they rubbed everything out. The other case study that I would have liked to present in more detail is Newark. And Newark, I gave a B2. We gave a B2, and it didn't get an A because of how it lasted. It's got problems, specifically a golf course that is in the way. Where can I get to somewhere? So what are all these? What is the future, I suppose, of preservation in Ohio? I think that something that we don't think about is how these things were in the past community centers. This is a way to bring communities together. Right now, preservation in the future doesn't necessarily consider that, but these are places where communities can be built. There's an obvious connection to ancient past, connections to more recent past as people invest in with these places with meaning. Descendant communities, the native groups historically associated with the area can be tied to it, and the locals, and artifacts. We have 21st century tools, extended reality, augmented and virtual technologies that I wanted to talk about, how we can sort of repaint the past onto the existing landscape, and connect people who can't visit really in the physical space and connect to them in a virtual one, and provide oral histories, social media tools, all that good stuff that we're used to. How do we begin? Well, somebody has to start it. what is a grassroots local organization, an institution, members of native and non-native descendant communities, whether they live there any longer or not, whoever. But to be successful, they have to broaden that circle almost immediately. These mounds and earthworks are not monolithic when it comes to the stories they carry. And preservation and restoration involves creating ties between disparate interest groups. It's not always been done in the past. Would have heard about that in Newark had I at any way timed this appropriately. Individuals may not agree with one another at all times, but they at least can come to understand and respect one another's perspective and understand how their connections to these mounds and earthworks can be used and perhaps should be used as an opportunity to discuss, as an opportunity to build community rather than just put up a fence, put up a museum, should take some fourth graders there on field trips and call it a day. So that's a horribly abbreviated version, but it's as close as it's going to get. Sorry.
No, thank you for your presentation, and hopefully that gives people enough of a taste that they can bring other things that they didn't get to hear up in the question and answer. So thanks for your presentation. We'll move next to William C. Koslov. He holds degrees from Asbury College, Marquette University, and the University of Notre Dame, his PhD, where the focus of his work was American intellectual and religious history. He is director of the Brethren Historical Library and Archives in Elgin, Illinois. He is the author of Holy Jumpers, Evangelicals and Radicals in Progressive Era America, published by Oxford in 2010, and editor of the Historical Dictionary of the Holiness Movement, 2009. His work has appeared in Wisconsin Magazine of History, Christian History, and the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. He has served as professor of history and political science at Tabor College and as archivist and special collections librarian for Asbury Theological Seminary. He's a fellow of the Center for the Study of Anabaptist and Pietist Groups at Elizabethtown College, Pennsylvania, and he'll be presenting No Darker Page in American History, James A. Freer and the Progressive Response to Native Americans in Crisis. Go ahead. And I think you're still on mute, so if you want to go ahead and take yourself off mute so we don't miss what you're saying. Thanks.
Being unmuted. In 1925, veteran Wisconsin Congressman James Freer, in retaliation for his support of Robert La Follette's 1924 Progressive Party presidential candidate, was removed from the powerful House and Ways Committee and assigned to the House Committee on Indian Affairs. Freer, who had no Native Americans in his district, was probably not surprised with the reassignment. He was a graduate of Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, and a native of Hudson, Wisconsin, and had served as and had established a law practice at Hudson. In 1904, he was elected to the Wisconsin State Senate, served 3 terms as Wisconsin Secretary of State, and in 1914 was elected to the Wisconsin's 10th Congressional District in rural Northwest Wisconsin. Basically 5 characteristics. The first thing about Freer, he was a La Follette loyalist, which in 1915 helped you a lot, especially in rural Western Wisconsin. And he also, his sort of typical of Freer's rhetoric in his memoirs he wrote, referring to La Follette, "No man in all history, I am confident, acting practically alone, American or European, ever accomplished individually so many reforms in state and national legislation as La Follette." Praise like that, Fighting Bob loved to hear, and so the relationship was close. He was also noted as a critic of government pork barrel legislation, and gotten in his early career as a member of the Rivers and Harbors Committee, spent lots of time attacking pork barrel legislation. And like many progressives, basically, of the era, he's a fiscal conservative, concerned with balanced budgets and fighting government waste. Like other Wisconsin progressives, he voted against U.S. entry into World War I, which resulted in most of them being voted out of office in 1918. However, Freer's Northwest Wisconsin district enthusiastically reelected him. He had, as a member of the Insular Affairs Committee, he had been an enthusiastic supporter of Filipino independence, as lots of the other Wisconsin progressives were. He also was very active in supporting certain social justice causes, especially promoted by women's groups. And he was the legislative sponsor, basically in Washington, of legislation for the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And he annually introduced a bill in Congress requiring a plebiscite or a vote to declare war if the US was ever to enter war. In the 1930s, this got a lot more attention after, and it's known as the Ludlow Amendment because it part of the isolationist impulse of the 1930s, but actually Freer was the author of the bill and initially introduced it in Congress. With his connections to women's groups, almost immediately after he was named to the Indian Affairs Committee, he was contacted by Stella Atwood, who is the chair of the Indian Welfare Committee of the Indian Defense of the Federation of Women's Clubs of America. And Atwood introduced Freer to John Collier, one of the most important Indian reformers of the era, who had founded the American Indian Defense Association. The focus of Collier's campaign was basically, and he'd later become head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs during the New Deal, was defending Native American cultural and religious rights in the 1920s. And Freer, while supportive of those rights, was probably more interested in defending Native American economic and legal rights, and sort of typical of progressives. And initially, he was involved in a couple of cases defending the Navajo Indians who were being forced to build a bridge that was only on one side. It was essentially going to be used for tourism, and the tribe opposed it, and Freer, with the support of Collier, also opposed it. Also, he was concerned about issues related to the excessive taxes on Indian-owned natural and mineral rights. But much of the focus of Freer's critique turned into an attack on the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which in the 1920s was headed by Charles H. Burke and Edgar Merritt. And these people were longtime government bureaucrats. They were champion of the old Indian policies that basically was committed to individualizing and essentially terminating tribal rights and making Indians into proper American farmers and business people. Also, the other issue that emerged in the 1920s was the Bureau of the Budget had been established, and that with the large costs related to World War I, the government tried to rein in spending, and this was particularly difficult for Indian health and welfare conditions, which were very dependent on spending from the federal government. Freer was a caustic critic of his opponents. And just to give you a style of the Freer critique of, I'm going to read this from a speech in 1914. I do not believe Congress, if made acquainted with the situation, will ever consent to this unjust proposal, but I am calling attention to the willingness of Commissioner Burke and his Bureau, according to the bill, to surrender to this oil mob all those permits illegally given by Fall, and then to acquire helpless Indians to pay all the taxes for the oil mob. I submit the evidence of the refusal to protect Indians again is overwhelming. Returning to the subject of Indian justice, Freer vividly described the process through which Commissioner Burke controlled the Indian legal process. Burke, Freer charged, made the laws, appointed Indian agents who in turn appointed Indian judges. These sub-deputy commissioners, Freer noted, are above the law and in fact are the law that judge the jury in the final court of appeals. Freer concluded, not only the commissioner, but the entire Bureau should be investigated, dismissed from public service with a temporary dissolution arrangement. Thereby, Indians may be accorded their full rights without needless delay. A fair, impartial probe ought to present an intelligent, speedy method of winding up the government's mismanagement of Indian affairs and the abolishment of archaic bureaucratic control that always has been and always will be connected with scandal. Part of the challenge, and Ferd made several large-scale trips to the West that were highly covered, and he wrote an article in Plain Talk, a widely circulated sort of left magazine, that in turn was quoted, ended up being quoted in the Ladies' Home Journal and quoted by journalist Vera Conley. The Freer article from Plain Talk was also appeared in Reader's Digest, and Freer's critique was basically, resulted in the famous Mirren Commission investigation of Native American policies in the late 1920s, which resulted in both Burke and Merritt being removed from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Part of the challenge, and in many ways, Burke, who had been a former congressman from South Dakota, argued that the problem actually was Congress, that Congress continually underfunded the agency and continually refused to support the needs and promises that they had made. Freers also was his highly, he did not work behind the scenes. His public attack on policies and personalities probably was also not helpful. However, Freer's active involvement, and it should be pointed out that much of Freer's his style probably hindered his effectiveness. At the same time, the proposals he also had were it was basically, he was a champion of defunding the Bureau of Indian Affairs and essentially getting rid of it, which would have resulted in Native Americans being basically dependent on state-supported programs. And it's hard to imagine that state-supported programs would have really addressed, would have actually dealt with the serious problems, especially health, welfare, and Indian civil rights issues that were so common in the 1920s. And it's also clear that most states didn't have the adequate financial resources to assume such burdens anywhere. However, in spite of his obvious inadequacies, Congressman Freer was able to parlay punishment for his support of La Follette's failed 1924 presidential bid into an effort to promote a progressive agenda that sought fair representation for Native Americans. In concert with activists like John Collier, Stella Atwood, and journalist Vera Conley, Freer helped to expose real problems in a manner that was certain to attract attention and bring the plight of Native Americans to the attention of the public. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was, as Freer repeatedly charged, guilty of mismanagement, favoritism toward white economic interests. Its administration under Burke and Merritt reflected the concerns that had produced the Dawes Act, individualization and Americanization, not the new concerns raised by anthropologists and other social scientists for the maintenance of tribal identity. Freer's efforts contributed to the appointment of Collier to head the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the creation of the Indian New Deal, which, while often criticized, represented a major shift in government policy toward Native Americans, and the passage of the Wheeler-Howard Act of 1934 that paved the way for Native Americans to gain more control of their actual and real destinies. Thank you.
Thank you. Excuse me. We will move next to Dr. Rory Finkenbein. He's a professor of history and director of the Black Abolitionist Archive at the University of Detroit Mercy. He teaches courses in African American history, modern Africa, slave resistance, the Civil War era, and the Underground Railroad. He has served on the Michigan Freedom Trail Commission since 2009, while on the editorial staff of the Black Abolitionist Papers Project at Florida State University. In the 1980s and 1990s, he co-edited the 5-volume Black Abolitionist Papers, 1830 to 1865, and Witness for Freedom, African American Voices on Race, Slavery, and Emancipation. He's also the author of Sources of the African American Past, as well as a dozen articles and book chapters on the Black abolitionists and the Underground Railroad. His op-eds have appeared in Time, Newsweek, Alternet, Raw Story, and Faithfully magazine. He is currently working on a book entitled Freedom Seekers in Indian Country, Sanctuaries and Crossings of the Old Northwest. And just real quick before we turn the time over to him, we will have a short question and answer at the end of the session, so you can be thinking of questions for any of the participants, and then when we come to that point, you can either ask them in person or put them in the chat. So go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherilyn. Okay. I'm not seeing everything I should at the top, but we'll proceed. This is part of a chapter in my larger book study, which is basically presenting a series of case studies that look at Native American assistance to freedom seekers leaving the slave South and going through the early Midwest or the Old Northwest during the first 6 decades of the 19th century. And this is a fairly late one, occurs during the Civil War era, and is a late example of seeking sanctuary among Native Americans. Even as more and more freedom seekers crossed the Old Northwest to Canada West, contemporary Ontario, especially after passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, hundreds still sought sanctuary in Indian country. Since Indian removal from the lower Northwest states of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois in the 1830s and 1840s, Indian country had usually come to mean segments of the upper Great Lakes region, primarily northern Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And among the most welcoming to enslaved African Americans on the run were the Odawa and Ojibwe in northern Michigan, the Stockbridge and Brotherton in Wisconsin, and the Dakota Sioux and Ojibwe in Minnesota. This search for sanctuary continued into the Civil War years when emancipation finally came. Among the freedom seekers who sought sanctuary in the upper Great Lakes region during this time was William Swan, who with his free Black wife, Louisa, an infant child, struck out for the wilderness of northern Michigan at the beginning of the Civil War. History does not record all of the reasons for their migration. We know that they desired to put an additional nearly 600 miles between themselves and the slave catchers and kidnappers who distressed Black communities in central and southern Indiana. Like the dozens of other African American families who migrated to northern Michigan in the 1860s, they were probably also pulled by the availability of untapped land. And they may have heard of the friendly Native Americans who lived in the region. More than one of these factors may have been at work, or all three. Whatever the case, it was a bold move. Very little is known about William Swan's background, except that he had been enslaved and escaped. Born into bondage in Virginia about 1824, he evidently remained in captivity for more than 3 decades. At some point, probably in the late 1850s, he fled to freedom. Details of escape have largely gone unrecorded, although the Native Americans he eventually encountered in northern Michigan remembered conversations about, quote, his brave flight north. By 1860, he'd made his way to Park County in west central Indiana. Park County was home to 2 significant African American farming settlements only a few miles from the Illinois line. Many of the families in these settlements were free Blacks who had migrated from North Carolina in the years after Nat Turner's rebellion, when growing fears emerged among whites that they were a dangerous presence amid slavery. A supportive Quaker community existed nearby. Together, these free Blacks and Quakers aided freedom seekers coming their way and were often accused by local authorities of harboring Negroes, that's in quotes. Not all in the county agreed with the assistance offered to African Americans on the run. As a result, those like Swan who came there saw Park County as a community both, quote, welcoming and hostile. Furthermore, it lay less than 140 miles from the slave state of Kentucky. There, Swan met and fell in love with a 17-year-old free Black woman named Louisa Morgan, who was apparently living with other Morgan relatives at the time. Her parents, George William and Delilah Morgan, had been enslaved in Robeson County, North Carolina, until they were manumitted in 1840. Louisa was born free in 1843. As life became more tenuous for free Blacks in the South, however, they loaded their children, including Louisa, into a covered wagon in 1847 and migrated to Franklin County in southeastern Indiana. With the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, they feared their freedom was once more in jeopardy, especially as kidnappers felt incentivized to capture free Blacks and make them into slaves. The family moved to Canada West about 1854, then in 1860 to the independent Black Republic of Haiti, hoping to, quote, find a home where they could live without fear of the children being kidnapped, unquote. Louisa remained in Indiana, by then in Park County. She and William married in 1860, and their first child, a daughter, Delilah, was born a year later. All of these fears about kidnapping, however, and William's own awareness that he was vulnerable to the slave catchers who regularly found their way to Park County, prompted the Swans to think about moving to a safer place. They ultimately decided on a location in northern Michigan. According to Morgan family lore, William and Louisa struck out for northern Michigan in 1861 or 1862. Evidence from the 1870 census enumeration of the Swan household suggests that daughter Delilah was born in late 1861, and other sources acknowledge that the Swans remained in Indiana until after her birth. So it's likely that they made their move sometime in the spring of 1862, after the ice had broken up on the Great Lakes and early enough to plant crops for the upcoming growing season. William and Louisa likely headed northward to Chicago and took a Lake Michigan steamer to Traverse City, which you see on the map, then walked the nearly 60 miles to what would become their new home. They almost certainly stopped at a general store in Charlevoix for supplies and carried these, their infant child, and their few personal possessions the final 10 miles along the footpath to the north shore of Pine Lake, that's contemporary Lake Charlevoix, to a gently sloping area covered with stands of beech and maple looking down toward the lake. The Swans were the first African Americans to settle in the vicinity. The 1860 U.S. Census lists no colored residents in, and that's a quote, no colored residents in Emmett County at the northwest tier of Michigan's Lower Peninsula. At that time, the county included present-day Emmett, Charlevoix, and a portion of Sheboygan counties, as well as Beaver Island, which until recently had been the home of the eccentric religious leader, James Jesse Strang, and his reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a Mormon sect that had settled there. On the mainland, the area was populated almost entirely by indigenous peoples, mainly Odawa and Ojibwe. There were only a few whites who had arrived since an 1855 treaty had opened some Native American land to settlers. The 1870 U.S. Census listed only 9 African Americans in the newly organized Charlevoix County. 8 of these were in the Swan household. The Swans were among hundreds of African Americans, many of them freedom seekers, who migrated to northern Michigan in the 1860s. According to author and journalist Betty DeRamus, they often, quote, found homes, hope, and sometimes hiding places in Michigan's North Country. Upon reaching their new home, the Swans squatted on 40 heavily wooded acres just up a rise, as you see, you were looking down the rise, from a north shore at the center of Pine Lake, and began to carve a farm out of the wilderness. Local African Americans soon introduced themselves to the new arrivals and offered their assistance. Together, William, Louisa, and their new neighbors cleared about 16 acres of what they now claimed as their property, without work animals and using only their own muscle. William built a 16 by 20 log cabin with a sleeping loft. They worked the cleared land the best they could, planting stands of corn and potatoes to feed the family. They also planted squash between the rows of corn, using a technique known as intercropping that they likely learned from their Indian neighbors. Life at the Swan farm could be a harsh, unfamiliar, and often lonely existence. Winters were brutally long and cold. The surroundings differed substantially from their life on the Indiana prairie and in the South. Their Indian neighbors were friendly, but culturally very distinct. The Swans were unacquainted with the varieties of trees, soil, and even some wild animals. Their nearest neighbor lived more than a half-mile away. Most days, even weeks, passed without seeing anyone beyond the family. They were engaged in subsistence farming, growing or making nearly everything they needed to sustain themselves. A very few times a year, they made their way to the nearest general store in Charlevoix, some 10 miles distance. The all-day trip required them to walk the footpath along the lake, then return with supplies and a harness on their back. Life in northern Michigan could be an unrelenting struggle. 4 factors really, I believe, allowed the Swans to negotiate this pioneer life. One was the relative safety they felt so far from the slave South. Another was the love and intimacy they shared. The Charlevoix Sentinel later commented on the kindness and respect that the 2 partners showed to each other. A third was their growing family circle of children, which often filled the log cabin with joy and excitement. And as a parent now of adult children, I'm sure remembering that there were other feelings probably that filled the cabin at various points. Once the farm and household had been established, 5 more children came in rapid succession. A girl named Laverta, 1864, a boy named Sedovia or Dovey, 1865, another girl, Louisa, 1866, a 4th girl, Meta, 1868, and another boy named George William, 1869, after Louisa's father. The final factor was the neighborliness shown by their Native American neighbors. For the first few years, the Swans' only neighbors consisted of a community of some 300 Odawa and Ojibwe, centered around a church nearly 7 miles away from the Swans' farm, on the lake footpath and the Indian trails nearby. Known as the Pine Hill Mission, or the Green Sky Hill Indian United Methodist Church today, still stands. The congregation had been founded when Ojibwe evangelist Peter Greensky arrived near Charlevoix in the late 1830s. Greensky and his followers originally worshipped elsewhere, but after white missionaries thought them, quote, too noisy when they prayed, he led 28 families to what became known as Green Sky Hill, about 2 miles above Pine Lake. At first, they held services in a small dwelling, but as the congregation grew, a larger structure was needed. Built over the course of a decade, the Pine Hill Mission was completed and opened for use in 1863, shortly after the Swans arrived in the area. The white frame building, set within a clearing in the forest, was surrounded by a churchyard dotted with white wooden crosses marking members who had died. Lacking a church bell, a conch shell could be heard calling members to worship each Sunday morning and Thursday evening. Although the Swans never became members, they maintained a close relationship with the Green Sky Indians, as they were locally known. Under the protective gaze of the Green Sky Indians, the Swans seem to have thrived in the northern Michigan environment where they cast their lot. They also felt relatively secure in the first years there, especially after news filtered in of Congress's 1864 repeal of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and the end of slavery 1 year later with the Union victory in the Civil War. Although far from the battlefield, the conflict impacted their Indian neighbors. Perhaps with William Swan in mind, Peter Greensky preached to his congregation and his congregants about their obligation to help free the suffering slaves in the South. 2 of his sons enlisted in Company K of the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters, an all-Indian unit. Benjamin Greensky was killed at the Battle of Spotsylvania in Virginia in 1864. Jacob Greensky suffered a disabling wound 1 year later at the siege of Petersburg. For the Swans, however, their farm and its surroundings seemed like a place of safety. Circumstances would change, however, after the war was over. On November 21st, 1867, William paid $5 and filed an original homestead entry on the 40 acres where he lived. A growing number of white settlers had moved into the area since the Civil War ended, and he probably feared losing his claim to the land on which they had squatted. Both he and they were responding to the Homestead Act of 1862, which had been passed through Congress by the Lincoln administration and become law on January 1, 1863. If one filed a homestead entry and lived in the land for 5 years, built a domicile, and made improvements, they would receive title to the property. Under the act, nearly 18,000 individuals and families, including many African Americans, homesteaded 2.3 million acres in the northern two-thirds of Michigan. In 1860, 71% of Michigan African Americans had lived in the lower 3 tiers of counties in the state. The decade that followed, hundreds moved into the northern counties of the state's lower peninsula. More than 100 made their way to the upper peninsula. By the 1870s, the outlines of a town called Undine took shape just north of the Swans farm, as you see on the map there, centered around a sawmill that had just been constructed. It had been birthed by this growing presence of homesteaders, including many white homesteaders in the area. In June 1820, 2 white Union veterans killed William in what can only be described as a hate crime. It took place as he walked the 60 miles between his farm down the path toward Traverse City, where he planned to meet relatives arriving on a Lake Michigan steamer. As he passed through the village of Atwood, he was verbally accosted with racial epithets by brothers Gilbert and Charles Randall, who had recently settled in the area and were offended by the presence of a black man. Guns were drawn, then eventually put away, but this was not the end of the affair, however. The Randalls and a third white man followed Swan nearly 5 miles down the trail. Upon catching up with him just north of the village of Eastport, they shot him dead. Although both Randall brothers were arrested and jailed for the crime, they were eventually acquitted of all charges. When word of the murder reached the Green Sky Indians, a group of them took their canoes across Pine Lake, then walked down to Eastport to retrieve Swan's body, carrying it back home on an improvised stretcher. When other local churches refused to bury a black man in their churchyard, the Green Sky Indians interred him at the Pine Hill Mission among dozens of Native American graves. Sometime later, they placed a marble marker commemorating Swan's presence there. It noted that he was a, quote, Green Sky brother. In death, the Green Sky Indians had adopted him fully as one of their own. I regret to inform you that in winter of 2019, a huge branch in the churchyard came crashing down and shattered this marker to smithereens, and they're now determining what the congregation does to commemorate Swan's presence there. William's death was not the only tragedy that hit the Swan family that summer. Their cabin burned to the ground. The youngest daughter, Meta, fell deathly ill. She would die 3 years later. The Green Sky Indians helped the family rebuild the cabin and regularly brought enough fish, meal, and vegetables to sustain them until the harvest. During these troubles, Louisa's relatives queried her about the supposed dangers of living among the Odawa and Ojibwa and urged her return southward. She responded with the quote you see here: "Better neighbors I have not lived with than these. They are indeed kind, and those Indians are so far from savages that they are the greater part of them Christians. They are not savages, but friends." For Louisa, and before his untimely death, William, the best part of their lives had been spent under the protective gaze of the Green Sky Indians. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was fabulous. We'll go ahead and move to my presentation, and then we'll go to the question and answer. So I'll read my short bio and then go into my paper. So I'm the managing editor of the Wilfred Woodruff Papers. It's a documentary editing project based around the 7,000-page journal of early 19th century religious figure Wilfred Woodruff, fourth president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as well as thousands of pages of other documents. And in my spare time, I'm a PhD candidate at Texas Christian University, working on my dissertation entitled Native Americans, Traders, Latter-day Saints, and Other Settlers, Networks in the Missouri Borderlands During the Jacksonian Era. I earned my BA and my MA in history from Brigham Young University. And in addition to Borderlands and Indigenous studies, my interests also include women's history, history of early Latter-day Saint movements, living history, pedagogy, and incorporating writing into the history classroom. So today, it's kind of fun to see the interactions between the different papers, specifically with the most recent one, the idea of borders and slave borders, and with the Fugitive Slave Act, what really weren't slave borders. Today, I want to talk about borderlands. Historian Richard White's statement that the boundaries of the American West are a series of doors pretending to be walls rings true for Western Missouri during the Jacksonian era. Although lines were drawn on maps, these lines were regularly and easily crossed, and my paper is going to analyze how. Becca Hamelianen and Samuel Truitt have described regions in which people crossed borders, borderlands if you will, quote, as ambiguous and often unstable realms where boundaries are also crossroads, peripheries are also central places, homelands are also passing through places, and the endpoints of empire are also forks in the road. Independence, Missouri is located at the very edge of the western edge of the formally organized United States of America in the 1820s and 1830s. And there's a clear boundary line. I will share my screen for a minute. My faithful laptop has gotten me through graduate school, but if I share it for too long, it will probably freeze. So here's hoping it doesn't freeze. I wanted to just show you this one slide because so much of my paper will be talking about the borders that you can see here. This is the western edge. I'll jump up here to this previous one. It's the western edge of Missouri that we're looking at. And so here is kind of the northwestern, the Missouri River is coming through here. And then zoomed in here, you can see that there's Kickapoos, Delawares, Kansas, Shawnees, and then Iowas. It's the traditional homeland of the Osage Indians. So you have kind of a visual. We're at the western edge of Missouri. As you can see on that map, across the border in Indian Territory, the federal government is constantly dividing and redividing the lands to different Native American configurations. However, until permission is granted, Anglo-Americans are not permitted to live west of the border. They're not permitted to trade west of the border, and they're not permitted to preach or proselytize west of the border. They're forbidden, in fact. Yet, despite the apparent formality of the border, this border is crossed legally and illegally with some regularity. Scholar Rebecca K. Mergenthal notes of the western border of Missouri, the line, quote, the line has broader significance because national politicians intended it to differentiate U.S. and Indian territories, right? They draw this border between, the border separated the native and Missouri settlers, and politicians believed it would prevent interactions in the area. However, other border residents had their own ideas and did what they could to make the boundary more permeable. I'm going to start with a quick overview of the people who are living in this area. And so you can see a little bit from the map, but also to clarify. So we're just below the Missouri River on the far western edge of Missouri. And there's a resident named William McCoy. He moves from Ohio to Missouri in 1838, and he writes this letter back to his future wife in Ohio, describing his impressions of independence. Independence is about 12 miles east of that Missouri border. He says, quote, "It is a fine place to observe the differences of individual character. We have an incongruous assortment at all times here. The mountain and Santa Fe traders, who are frequently here, are a class sui generis. There are sometimes Indians here of almost all the tribes known, as entirely different from each other in language, manners, and customs as the antipodes. There were some here a few days ago of the Blackfeet, Flatheads, and Snakes who had never seen a white settlement before. There are Shawnees, Delawares, Peorias, Potawatomis, Kickapoos, Kaskaskias, Weehas, Miamis, Sac, and Foxes, and I don't know how many more situated on the frontier, who make occasional peregrinations through this place. He also noted, quote, Mexicans, Californians, and strangers from every state in the Union find their way thither. Right, so we've got independence as kind of this crossing place in the 1830s. However, there's also local residents, some who'd been settling there since the early 1820s. When the first county clerk, when the first county court met, the first Jackson County Circuit Court clerk in the 1820s, Robert Wilson, was, quote, so unfavorably impressed with what he regarded as the roughness and uncultivated manners of the people that he resigned his position in disgust. And I find this really intriguing because he's not brand new from back east, but he's just from one county over. But there's something about the nature of people who are living right there on the border, right on the edge. A lot of the historical literature describes it as a rough, a wild, a lawless place. Washington Irvin, as he traveled through Independence, Missouri in 1832, described it as, quote, a little straggling frontier village that has only been 5 years in existence. Due to the proximity to Indian territory, some scholars have argued that it was a magnet for those who were seeking to avoid federal law. And so they would live in Independence, federal marshal or any sort of federal entity comes to town, they can run across the border, hide out in Indian territory, and then come back. But according to census records, almost every household has a woman present, and most of them have small children as well. So it kind of begs the question of how much of this lawless nature is a reputation that Independence is seeking to cultivate, and for what reason. Either way, knowing that we have a less than law-abiding element or a wild element gives additional context to Morgenthal's statement, quote, when and why border residents found it possible to cross the border and the nature of federal and local authorities' attempts to prevent these crossings reveal the implications of mobility for the region's inhabitants, whether they moved or not, and for the border itself. And so basically, I want to take a few minutes and look at some of the people who cross the border legally and some of the people who cross the border illegally. We'll start with the Native Americans, right? We often look at the Indian Removal Act and the statutes before then of the government trying to draw this dividing line between Native Americans and Anglo settlers on the east side of the border. But if you look at the sources, members of indigenous groups are regularly crossing the border back into Missouri, sometimes to hunt, but often to trade. And we get a little insight into the frequency of their trade. Francois Chateau was a French fur trader who had settled in what became the Kansas City area. And he settled in the early 1820s. And he noted in letters back to his business partners in St. Louis that if he did not offer good prices when he was in Indian Territory trading with the native groups, or when they came to his location to trade, he said that the indigenous groups would simply go over to Independence and trade there themselves, especially after receiving their yearly annuity payments. It was as early as 1828 that Independence is capitalizing on Native American trade. So the Osage had relinquished their claims to the land in 1825. So this is just 3 years after the Osage had given up their land. And that settlers have established stores that are drawing the Osage, the Shawnee, the Delaware back in. Chateau reports in a November 1828 letter that the Shawnee, quote, used a part of their money at a store that is there in Independence. And then a month later, he again writes, the Shawnee think that we sell our goods a bit high, that they are able to buy cheaper at Independence, but they will not consider, or pretend not to consider, that our merchandise is infinitely superior to what is found elsewhere. He begins considering opening a store himself in Independence. He writes to his business partner, who's also his father-in-law and his uncle, Pierre Menard, I believe that if you had a small store in Independence in Jackson County, that would be to your advantage. The Indians go there often, especially when they have money. We could also make out pretty well with the whites because the land is well settled. He also noted his assessment of the store that goods are expensive and business is carried on at a good pace. Just a few weeks later, he's again writing to his business partner. I think it'd be great to have a store in Independence because, once again, the annuities that the Indians will receive always, for the most part, will go there. So we have this border that's not quite so hard and fast. Again, Richard White says a series of doors pretending to, or a series of walls pretending to be doors. Series of doors pretending to be walls. I said it right the first time. So they're going back and forth to trade. Secondly, we have those who are preaching to the American Indians who live in Missouri and are regularly crossing the state line. Isaac McCoy is an early Baptist missionary. His son-in-law, Johnston Likens, their families, at least for part of the time, are settled in Missouri, but they're crossing the border into Indian Territory. So we've now got people coming east to trade, going west to preach. But perhaps one of the most intriguing examples, at least to me, is of enslaved people working across the border in Indian Territory. So on paper, Missouri is a slave state. On paper, Indian Territory in the 1840s is a free territory, but this border remains fuzzy in practice. On the ground, we have Indian agent Richard Cummins. He's later going to prevent some Christian missionaries from going into Indian Territory without a license. However, when it comes to his own personal self-interest, there's maybe a little bit more wiggle room because he's approving applications from multiple slaveholders, allowing their enslaved men to work as blacksmiths or assistant blacksmiths among the Shawnee and Delaware nations in Indian Territory. One of these slaveholders is his son-in-law. Mergenthal scholar notes, quote, these Missouri slaveholders who are applying to have their slaves hired out to be the blacksmiths for the Shawnee and Delaware tribes. These Missouri slaveholders did not attach significance to which side of the line they hired their slaves. While they enjoyed the regularity of a government salary, what they wanted most of all was economic opportunity, which they sought on both sides of the border. Their disregard for what the line distinguished required a reworking of the line's meaning. On the ground, the distinction between slave Missouri and free Indian country was not clear, and the federal government failed to enforce the difference effectively. The border revealed the divided lines of authority in the area and presented locals with advantages unplanned and even opposed by federal authorities. Additionally, several Methodist missionaries owned slaves. And then lastly, in the last couple minutes, I want to touch on people who shouldn't have been crossing the border but were, and so illegally. These are traders without licenses. The government licensed only certain traders to trade with the Native American groups. And so we have Francois Chateau, whom I mentioned earlier. He's licensed to trade with the Shawnee and the Kansa nations. Almost all of his letters in the 1820s and 1830s talk about traders who are trading illegally. In November 1828, he writes of a man negotiating with the Kansa. A few weeks later, he's still concerned with Blando and the Kansa because Blando is not licensed. Chateau is licensed. In a distance, Chateau's licensed to trade with the Shawnee, but he notes in December 1828, quote, I learned that Gillis, an unauthorized rival trader, had the goods and his intention was to cross the state line and to build a house on Shawnee territory to trade with them. He again complains about Gillis the following month. And so we've got this first category of illegal is traders going across. Secondly, we've got missionaries. One set of missionaries who perhaps unwittingly crossed the border are members of the Church of Christ, what became the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And they come in the fall of 1830 and the early winter of 1831, and they seek to preach to the Delaware and to the Shawnee Indians. Richard Cummins, who's that Indian agent who allowed the slaveholders to have slavery or to hire out their slaves in Indian Territory, he cracks down on these missionaries, and he actually writes a letter to William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame, who's the Indian agent at the time. And he says, a few days ago, 3 men, all strangers to me, went among the Indians, Shawnees, and Delawares. They say for the purpose of preaching to and instructing them in religious matters. They say they are sent by God and must proceed. They have a new revelation. I have refused to let them stay or go among the Indians unless they first obtain permission from you or some of the officers of the general government whom I am bound to obey. I inform they intend to apply to you for permission to go among the Indians. They never get permission to actually preach among the Native Americans, and so they're kicked out. And the last one, which we'll skip over for sake of time, is people squatting on land. It's people who didn't have permission, but illegally, as we're all aware, along the American frontier, even that's a problematic term. They would settle, and then when land was opened up for Anglo-American settlement, then they would apply to live there. So we have illegal and legal people crossing. So in summary, I'm looking at this series of doors pretending to be walls, doors through which traders, native groups, missionaries, and settlers passed with relative ease and frequency, creating communities comprised of people from many walks of life. As Morgenthau says, the border separated the native and Missouri settlers, and politicians believed it would prevent interactions in the area. However, border residents had their own ideas and did what they could to make the boundary more permeable. Thank you. Okay, we'll take the last 6 or 7 minutes here to answer questions. It looks like we have a few questions, so we'll just go in order. First question is, are there any efforts to preserve indigenous earthworks that are taking place at the state or regional level in the Midwest? And so, Michael, obviously, I think we'll send that to you.
Yeah, I kind of dealt with it in a chat. I didn't know how much time we were going to have for it, but yeah, there certainly are attempts to include more stories at public sites. The Newark Earthworks in particular, you have kind of a contentious situation where you have a very well-maintained portion of it, the circle, but then there's an octagon that is also a golf course, and it's currently in the midst of a state Supreme Court case to try to break the golf course's lease and open it to the public, and so in a dramatic fashion that's happening. But there's also sort of grassroots efforts that I think are kind of more interesting in a way, where you have less dramatic sites where people are interacting and coming up with kind of novel ways to build connections with people who are historically associated with the region or currently associated. So I guess the answer in Ohio is, yeah, I don't know much beyond Ohio's borders about it, but I'd like to learn more.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? We do have a few minutes if we do have some
I would
questions.
just throw in though, if you like Earthworks, Cahokia in Illinois is pretty awesome. It's the largest earthwork in North America.
Yeah, I grew up about 20 minutes from there.
Yeah, and their museum is fabulous.
It is. Yeah, I volunteered there before I went to college a million years ago, and it was kind of it's amazing. It's an amazing site, but it also was kind of depressing because during the summer there were a few days when there weren't school visits, where there was one day in particular there were more visits from people from Europe than from Missouri.
That's what I'm hoping. I have a book coming out next spring, which is like places you have to see in the Midwest. So hoping
that's one of them.
Hope that's one of the locations, definitely.
Throw Newark in there once they get that up and running.
Next book.
Wonderful. Thank you. Any other questions? I have one for you, Dr. Finkenbein. As you were talking about the family and then what happened to them after his murder, how long, and maybe you said this and I might have missed it as I was getting my papers to make sure I was ready to start. How long did the family stay in the area after his death?
Actually, on that closing slide with the quote speaks to the extended family as well, because ultimately Louisa was so convincing that on her side, many of them came up over the next few years and in fact became important founding pioneers in lumberworks and other things in Boyne City in the Charlevoix area. She herself and her children stayed in the area for a while. She has a series of tragedies. Her daughter dies in William in 1870, her daughter in 1873. She remarries to an African-American farmer who's killed by a falling tree in 1885. And ultimately, I think she's had enough of tragedy in that area. And the context has changed. The population makeup has changed. And she marries a Flint fireman and ends up dying in Toledo in 1915. But the broader family, her siblings and their significant others stay on. And in fact, I was able to meet one of them when I was doing research on this. Yeah.
That's so neat. It's always wonderful to meet people who are related or have those ties to the area. We have one more question that has just popped in. It looks like they're about to send us back to the breakout room. So rather than getting cut off, I just wanted to thank all of our panelists for your preparation and for being here, and encourage you to maybe message him in the next or to reach out to him so he can answer that question. But thank you all for your participation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the Midwestern History Conference. It's great to see the revival in Midwestern history.
Thank you, Sherilyn.